Shaquille O'Neal stepped into the sleek glass doors of the luxury car dealership, his tall frame hard to miss, but his casual hoodie and sneakers making him blend into the background. The air inside reeked of polished surfaces and exclusivity, a shrine to wealth and status. A passing glance from the manager turned into a smirk of disdain, a judgment passed in seconds. "You sure you're in the right place?" The man sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. What followed was not just a clash of egos, but a masterclass in humility and respect, one that would leave the world stunned and a lesson that no one in the room would ever forget. The dealership sparkled with an air of exclusivity. Polished marble floors gleamed under chandeliers that cast a golden glow over the showroom. Rows of sleek, high-end vehicles stood like trophies, each one a testament to luxury and status. Employees in sharp suits moved with quiet efficiency, their eyes scanning every customer who walked through the glass doors, ready to pounce if they spotted a potential sale. And then Shaquille O'Neal walked in. He wasn't dressed like someone who belonged there, not by their standards anyway. A plain hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers made him blend into the everyday crowd. To the untrained eye, he was just another tall guy in comfortable clothes, his understated demeanor giving no hint of the superstar behind the casual attire. But Shaq wasn't there for show. He moved with purpose, his eyes sweeping the showroom until they landed on what he was looking for, a rare vintage car tucked in the far corner. Its black finish shone under the lights, and even from a distance, Shaq could see the craftsmanship that went into its creation. As he walked toward it, he could feel the weight of eyes on him. A group of salespeople exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. One of them, Richard Morrison, the manager, stepped forward. His stride was deliberate, his smile practiced, but the way his eyes scanned Shaq was unmistakable. Sharp, judgmental, dismissive. "Can I help you with something?" Richard's voice carried that polite tone reserved for people he didn't think were worth his time. Shaq turned to him and offered a small, polite smile. "I'm interested in the car over there," he said, nodding toward the vintage model. Richard followed Shaq's gaze and let out a soft, almost imperceptible chuckle. "That's a 1925 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost," he said, emphasizing the name, like it was a password to an exclusive club. "One of the rarest cars we have. Most people come in here to admire it, but very few can afford it." Shaq didn't flinch. His calm gaze stayed steady, and his voice remained even. "I'd still like to know more about it." Richard's smile tightened. "Of course, but just so you're aware, we typically work with serious buyers. This isn't a car for just anyone." The words hung in the air like a challenge. A couple of employees nearby turned to watch, sensing the growing tension. Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering Richard's statement. "Good to know," he said, his tone revealing nothing. Unbothered by the cold reception, Shaq stepped closer to the Rolls-Royce, letting his fingertips graze the smooth, gleaming surface. But behind him, Richard's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to people like this, quiet, self-assured, standing their ground in a place like his showroom. The room grew quieter as whispers spread among the staff. They watched as the tension between Richard and Shaq built, not realizing that this unassuming man was about to change everything. The air inside the dealership grew heavy. The quiet hum of conversation among employees faded as eyes discreetly turned toward Shaquille O'Neal and the manager, Richard Morrison. Something about their exchange had shifted the atmosphere. Richard's arms were crossed now, his posture stiff and his jaw set. "I don't think you understand," he said, his tone clipped, almost rehearsed. "This car isn't just about the price, it's about status. People who buy from us know they're getting something exceptional." His gaze lingered on Shaq's hoodie and sneakers, his expression making it clear he didn't think Shaq fit the mold. Shaq tilted his head slightly, calm as ever. "I'm here because I'm interested in something exceptional," he said, his voice deep but steady. "Isn't that why anyone comes to a place like this?" Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he'd already dismissed. "We usually deal with clients who—" He paused, searching for the right words, ones that would insult without being obvious. "Who are a bit more familiar with luxury." There it was. The insult hung in the air, barely veiled. A couple of employees shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other as if to ask, "Is this really happening?" Shaq didn't react right away. He let the moment linger, his gaze steady on Richard. "I see," he finally said, his voice calm but with an edge that was impossible to miss. "And how do you decide who's familiar with luxury?" Richard's smile was cold, his confidence unwavering. "Well," he said, gesturing around the gleaming showroom, "we can usually tell." The words hit like a slap. A few employees standing nearby seemed to freeze in place, their eyes darting back and forth between the towering figure of Shaq and the smaller, increasingly smug Richard. The tension in the room was thick now, palpable, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Shaq leaned slightly closer, just enough to match Richard's challenging tone. "Interesting," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. "And what do you see when you look at me?" Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough to reveal his discomfort, but he quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "Someone who might be in the wrong place." A quiet gasp escaped from one of the junior employees. Another customer near the entrance pretended to browse but was clearly eavesdropping. The words felt sharper than anything Richard had said so far. Shaq straightened, towering over the manager, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Funny," he said, his tone still measured, "because I thought I was exactly where I needed to be." For a moment, Richard didn't respond. He seemed caught off guard by Shaq's composure, by the way he refused to rise to the bait. But instead of backing down, Richard doubled down. "Let's be real here," Richard said, his voice lower but still dripping with condescension. "This isn't the kind of place for window shoppers." This time, the insult landed heavily. Even some of Richard's own staff seemed uncomfortable now. One of them, a younger man named Josh, shifted his weight awkwardly and glanced at Shaq, as if silently apologizing. But Shaq, as always, remained calm. He folded his arms across his chest, his gaze unwavering. "You're right," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "This isn't a place for window shopping. That's why I'm here to buy." Richard blinked. For a moment, his confidence wavered. He hadn't expected that. The silence that followed was deafening. Employees stared, customers exchanged nervous glances, and Richard's face reddened slightly, his smirk faltering. Shaq didn't move. He didn't need to. His quiet resolve filled the room, challenging every assumption Richard had made. The tension between them had reached its breaking point, but Shaq wasn't the one who would break. The silence in the dealership was so heavy you could hear the faint hum of the overhead lights. All eyes were on Shaquille O'Neal and Richard Morrison, who stood a few feet apart in the gleaming showroom. Richard's smirk faltered, just slightly, but his arrogance didn't waver. "So," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, "if you're serious about buying this car, maybe you can explain what makes it so special to you." Shaq's towering frame didn't shift. His calm, composed demeanor made him seem larger than life. He glanced at the car, a rare vintage Rolls-Royce gleaming under the lights, and then back at Richard. "I don't need to explain anything," Shaq replied, his voice steady. "But I'll say this. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you give." The words hit Richard like a well-aimed punch. His smirk evaporated, replaced by a flash of irritation. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he had already dismissed. "Respect?" Richard scoffed, stepping closer. "Respect is earned, and frankly, I'm not seeing much to earn it from you." His gaze darted to Shaq's sneakers, his hoodie. "You walk in here dressed like that, expecting to be treated like royalty? This is a luxury dealership, not a charity." The words were like shards of ice cutting through the air. A sharp intake of breath could be heard from one of the junior employees, a young man named Josh, who stood frozen near the reception desk. Shaq didn't flinch. His expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened, glinting with quiet strength. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Respect isn't about clothes," he said firmly. "It's about how we treat people, no matter who they are or where they come from." Richard laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're really serious about this, aren't you?" he said, gesturing toward the car. "Fine, let's talk numbers. This car, it's worth more than most people's homes. Do you even know the price tag on it? Or is this just some fantasy for you?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Employees glanced at one another, their discomfort growing by the second. A few customers stopped pretending to browse and openly watched the exchange. Shaq took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice dropped slightly, calm but cutting. "I know exactly what this car is worth," he said, "but do you know what respect is worth?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. For a moment, Richard was silent. He opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for Words, Shaq took another step forward, his towering presence impossible to ignore. You think you know who I am just because of what I'm wearing? He continued, his voice gaining a subtle edge. You think you can judge my worth by looking at me? Let me tell you something. You don't know anything about me. Richard's face reddened, his arrogance cracking under the weight of Shaq's words. I don't need to know you, he snapped. This isn't personal. It's business. And in this business, we deal with people who can afford to be here. Shaq's calm demeanor didn't falter. He straightened, his broad shoulders towering over Richard. And I'm telling you, he said quietly, you've got no idea who you're dealing with. The tension in the room was electric. It felt as though the very air had thickened, pressing down on everyone present. Josh, the junior employee, glanced nervously at Richard, then at Shaq, as if wondering whether he should step in. Finally, Shaq turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the showroom. He spoke not just to Richard, but to everyone within earshot. Respect isn't something you get to ration out based on appearances, he said. It's free, but it's also priceless. The room fell silent. Even Richard, for all his arrogance, seemed momentarily at a loss. His jaw worked, as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. Shaq didn't wait for a response. With a calm, deliberate movement, he turned and began walking toward the exit. His footsteps echoed through the showroom, each step a quiet declaration of dignity. As he reached the door, Richard found his voice again, shouting after him. You think you can just walk in here, make some speech, and leave? Shaq paused, his hand on the glass door. He turned his head slightly, his voice low but resonant. I didn't come here to make a speech, he said. I came here to teach you something. Whether or not you learn it is up to you. With that, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the sunlight, leaving behind a stunned silence. The dealership's glass door swung shut behind Shaquille O'Neal, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in its wake. Inside, the staff exchanged uneasy glances, their faces a mix of curiosity and tension. Richard Morrison stood frozen, his jaw clenched and his fists still balled at his sides. The quiet murmurs of the customers who had witnessed the exchange began to grow louder. What just happened? One of them whispered. In the corner, Karen, the dealership's senior accountant, sat at her desk. She had watched the entire incident unfold, her sharp eyes narrowing as she observed Richard's escalating arrogance. She reached for her laptop and started typing, curiosity gnawing at her. Something about the way Shaq carried himself, the calm authority, the measured words, stuck with her. He wasn't just any customer, she thought. There was more to this man. As Karen scrolled through a few search results, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened as she stared at the screen, the realization hitting her like a freight train. Oh no, she muttered under her breath. Karen stood abruptly, clutching a printout in her hand, and hurried toward Richard, who was still pacing near the reception desk. Richard, she called, her tone urgent. He turned, his face red with lingering frustration. What is it, Karen? He snapped, clearly not in the mood for interruptions. Karen hesitated for a moment, glancing around at the staff and customers, who were all pretending not to listen. We need to talk, now. Richard frowned, annoyed by her insistence. What could possibly be so important? Karen stepped closer, lowering her voice. That man you just humiliated, she began, her voice trembling slightly. He's not just some random guy off the street. That was Shaquille O'Neal. Richard blinked, confusion flickering across his face. Shaquille O'Neal? The basketball player? Karen nodded, her expression grim. Yes, and more than that, he's a major investor in the parent company that owns this dealership. The color drained from Richard's face. What are you saying? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Karen handed him the printout, a profile highlighting Shaquille O'Neal's business ventures and investments. I'm saying he's technically one of your bosses. For a moment, Richard didn't move. He just stared at the paper, his mind racing. The smug confidence he had exuded moments ago was replaced by a rising tide of panic. You've got to be kidding me, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Meanwhile, outside the dealership, a young customer named Ethan stood near his car, his phone in hand. He had recorded the entire interaction between Shaq and Richard, his fingers trembling slightly as he rewatched the footage. Every word, every sneer, and every calm, measured response from Shaq was captured perfectly. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then opened his social media app and uploaded the video with the caption, "When a legend teaches a lesson in respect." He tagged a few friends and added a couple of hashtags, done in respectus luxury, Chuck or Shaq story, and hit post. What Ethan didn't anticipate was how quickly the video would gain traction. Within minutes, it started spreading, shared by users who were outraged by Richard's behavior and inspired by Shaq's dignity. Comments poured in, ranging from anger toward the dealership to admiration for Shaq. Unbelievable. How could they treat him like that? This is why respect shouldn't be based on appearances. Shaq is a class act. That manager needs to learn a thing or two. Back inside the dealership, Richard's phone buzzed incessantly. He ignored it at first, but as the notifications piled up, he finally glanced at the screen. His heart sank. Dozens of messages and missed calls from colleagues, clients, and even the dealership's parent company filled his notifications. "Richard," Karen said, her voice cutting through his growing panic, "this is going viral. If this gets any bigger, it could ruin us." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his mind spinning. "I'll call him," he said suddenly. "I'll apologize. Apologize?" Karen interrupted, her tone incredulous. "You humiliated him in front of everyone. Do you really think a simple apology will fix this?" Richard didn't respond. He knew she was right. The damage had been done, and now the entire dealership was at risk of becoming the face of prejudice and arrogance. Outside, Ethan's video continued to gain momentum, reaching thousands of views in a matter of hours. Major media outlets began picking up the story, amplifying the backlash. The dealership, once a symbol of exclusivity and luxury, was now at the center of a public scandal. As Richard stared out the showroom window, watching the sunlight reflect off the sleek cars he had once been so proud of, a sinking realization settled in his chest. His actions had set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. And Shaquille O'Neal? He was out there somewhere, calm and collected, leaving behind a lesson that Richard would never forget. The video spread like wildfire. It started as a single post from Ethan, the young customer, but within hours it had been shared, retweeted, and reposted across every major social media platform. The footage captured everything: the tension in the dealership, Richard's sneering remarks, and Shaq's calm, dignified response. The caption, "When a legend teaches a lesson in respect," resonated deeply with viewers. By noon, the video had reached tens of thousands of views. By evening, it had gone viral. Twitter hashtags like #RespectIsLuxury and #ShaqStory trended worldwide. Celebrities, athletes, and influencers chimed in, amplifying the outrage. "Shaq showed more grace than that manager deserved," one tweet read, garnering thousands of likes. "This is why appearances don't matter. Respect is everything," another commented. Underneath the flood of admiration for Shaq, a darker wave of backlash was brewing against Morrison's Auto Emporium. Comments flooded the dealership's social media pages, each one angrier than the last. "How dare you treat Shaquille O'Neal like that? This is disgusting. I'll never step foot in your dealership again. Fire that manager or lose your customers for good." The public outrage was swift and unforgiving. Ethan's video had struck a nerve, shining a light on the prejudice and arrogance that too often went unchecked in places of luxury and exclusivity. Major news outlets picked up the story. Headlines like, "Shaq's Grace exposes ugly truth at luxury dealership," and "When respect costs nothing but means everything," dominated the media cycle. Morning talk shows discussed the incident, using the video as a launching pad for conversations about bias, humility, and the power of character. Meanwhile, Shaq remained silent. He didn't post a response or comment on the situation, which only added to the mystique. His restraint spoke volumes. Where others might have lashed out or sought revenge, he chose to let his actions and words in the dealership speak for themselves. Back at Morrison's, the fallout was immediate and severe. Customers began canceling appointments and withdrawing offers. One longtime client posted on Instagram, "I've spent years buying cars from Morrison's." Not anymore. Respect is non-negotiable. Inside the dealership, chaos reigned. Employees whispered nervously among themselves, checking their phones for updates as the situation spiraled out of control. Richard, however, was in denial. He stormed through the showroom, barking orders and insisting that things would blow over. But Karen, the senior accountant, knew better. She stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold. "You don't get it, do you?" she finally said, stepping forward. "This isn't just going to blow over. You didn't just humiliate a customer. You humiliated Shaquille O'Neal. And now the whole world knows." Richard glared at her, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. "I'll apologize," he muttered. "I'll fix this." Karen shook her head. "It's too late for that. Apologies won't undo the damage you've done. This isn't just about Shaq. It's about what you represent." As the dealership's reputation crumbled, the parent company stepped in. Late that evening, they issued a public apology. "We are deeply troubled by the incident that occurred at Morrison's Auto Emporium. We are committed to investigating the matter and ensuring all customers are treated with the respect they deserve." But the damage was done. The apology was met with skepticism, with many accusing the company of trying to save face rather than addressing the root of the problem. By the next morning, Richard was officially suspended. The parent company announced an internal review of all management practices, vowing to implement changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Through it all, Shaq remained a symbol of grace and strength. His silence spoke louder than any statement ever could, allowing the world to draw its own conclusions. In the eyes of millions, he had turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson in humility and dignity, a reminder that respect isn't just a luxury, it's a necessity. 1 week later, Shaquille O'Neal stepped out of his black SUV, dressed in a tailored suit that radiated quiet authority. The sun was high in the Los Angeles sky, its golden rays bouncing off the gleaming glass walls of Morrison's Auto Emporium. This time, Shaq wasn't arriving as a curious customer. He was coming back to deliver a lesson. Inside the dealership, the atmosphere was tense. Employees whispered nervously as they saw the towering figure approach the entrance. Richard stood behind the counter, his face pale and drawn. The past week had been a nightmare for him. The viral video had turned his arrogance into a public scandal. The parent company had suspended him, and his reputation was in tatters. Now seeing Shaq return, he felt his stomach twist in knots. Shaq walked through the glass doors, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. The once bustling showroom fell silent. Every eye was on him, watching, waiting. Richard hesitated before stepping forward, his usual confidence replaced with visible unease. "Mr. O'Neal," Richard began, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I want to apologize for my behavior last week. I didn't realize—" Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off. Not aggressively, but firmly. His deep voice resonated through the room, calm and measured. "This isn't about me, Richard. This is about respect." Richard blinked, unsure how to respond. He opened his mouth to speak, but Shaq wasn't finished. He turned slightly, addressing the entire room. "Respect," Shaq began, his voice carrying weight, "isn't something you earn by wearing a suit or standing behind a fancy desk. It's not about the car you drive or the watch on your wrist. Respect comes from how you treat people, no matter who they are or what they look like." The employees stood frozen, absorbing every word. Even the customers in the showroom paused, their interest piqued by the quiet power in Shaq's tone. "I didn't come here today to humiliate anyone or to seek revenge," Shaq continued, locking eyes with Richard. "I came here because I believe in second chances. But second chances only matter if you're willing to learn and change." Richard's face reddened, and he looked down, shame flickering across his features. I understand, Mr. O'Neal," he stammered. Shaq stepped closer, his towering frame casting a shadow over Richard. "Do you?" he asked, his voice soft but piercing. "Because if you do, you'll realize this isn't just about me. It's about every person who walks through these doors, hoping to be treated with dignity. You don't know their stories, their struggles. Judging them by their appearance only reflects your own limitations." The room remained silent, the weight of Shaq's words sinking into every corner. Even the junior employees who had once giggled nervously now looked at Richard with a mixture of pity and disappointment. Shaq's gaze softened slightly as he took a step back, giving Richard room to breathe. "I'm not here to fire you," he said, his tone surprising everyone. I could, but that wouldn't fix anything. Instead, I'm giving you an opportunity to change, to grow. Richard looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. You mean I still have a chance? Shaq nodded. But it's up to you. I want you to take accountability. Apologize. Not just to me, but to your team and your customers. Undergo diversity training. Learn what respect really means. Richard hesitated, his pride warring with his guilt. But as he looked around, meeting the eyes of his employees and customers, he realized he had no choice. With a shaky breath, he nodded. I'll do it, he said quietly. Shaq turned to the staff, addressing them directly. This isn't just about one person. Respect is something we all have to practice every day. It's what builds trust, loyalty, and success. If you can commit to that, this dealership can become a place where everyone feels valued. A ripple of approval spread through the employees. For the first time in days, the air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Richard cleared his throat, his voice trembling. I apologize to all of you, he said, his gaze sweeping the room. I let my arrogance cloud my judgment. I promise to do better, to be better. Shaq gave a small nod, satisfied but not triumphant. Good, he said. Now let's see if you mean it. As Shaq left the dealership, the staff and customers watched him go with a newfound respect, not just for his stature or fame, but for the integrity he had shown. He hadn't just walked in to make a point, he had walked in to make a difference. In the days following his visit to the dealership, Shaquille O'Neal couldn't shake the memory of Richard's face, first filled with arrogance, then hollowed by shame. It wasn't about bringing him down. Shaq knew he wanted to turn this incident into something meaningful, something that could reach far beyond one man's mistake. Sitting in his home office, Shaq scrolled through the viral video that had exploded on social media. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Most condemned Richard's behavior, but many praised Shaq's calm and composed response. This isn't just about me, Shaq thought, leaning back in his chair. It's about how we all treat each other. With that thought, Shaq picked up his phone and called his manager. I want to start something, he said firmly. Something that teaches people how to treat each other with respect, no matter what. His manager, who had grown used to Shaq's big-hearted ideas, didn't hesitate. I'll set up the meeting, he replied. Within a week, Shaq announced his latest initiative, Respect in Action. It was more than a campaign. It was a commitment to creating change. The program focused on workplace training, promoting diversity and inclusion, and fostering empathy in customer service. Shaq partnered with nonprofits, community leaders, and even corporations to ensure the message reached as many people as possible. The first step, starting at the dealership where it all began. Shaq returned to Morrison's Auto Emporium with a small team of trainers and counselors. This time, he wasn't there to lecture Richard or humiliate him further. He was there to rebuild. The staff gathered nervously in the showroom, unsure of what to expect. Richard stood off to the side, his usually sharp demeanor softened by days of reflection. Shaq stepped forward, his towering frame impossible to ignore. But his tone was warm, not intimidating. We're not here to point fingers, he began, his deep voice carrying through the room. We're here to learn, to grow. Because respect isn't just about doing the right thing when someone's watching. It's about making it part of who you are. The room was silent, save for the occasional scribble of pens as employees took notes during the training session. Richard, sitting in the front row, listened intently, his expression a mix of remorse and determination. He asked questions, participated in group exercises, and even shared his thoughts on how he could do better. Meanwhile, Shaq's initiative spread far beyond the walls of the dealership. Other businesses reached out, inspired by his efforts. How can we bring this training to our staff? They asked. Shaq's team worked tirelessly to create workshops and online courses that could be adapted for different industries. Fellow athletes and celebrities joined the cause, using their platforms to promote respect in action. One NBA star tweeted, "Shaq's right. Respect is the foundation of everything. Let's build a world where everyone feels valued." A famous actress shared the viral video, captioning it, "Humility is strength." Thank you, Shaq, for reminding us of that. At the same time, Shaq ensured that the initiative had tangible benefits for the community. He organized scholarships for underprivileged youth, funding their education and encouraging them to pursue careers where they could make a difference. He also established grants for small businesses, helping them implement training programs that promoted inclusivity. Richard, for his part, didn't just go through the motions. Humbled by the experience, he became an advocate for change within the dealership. He held meetings with his staff, encouraging open dialogue and addressing biases. Slowly, the culture at Morrison's began to shift. Customers noticed the difference, leaving positive reviews about how welcoming the dealership had become. One day, as Shaq visited the dealership to check on their progress, Richard approached him with a genuine smile. "Thank you," he said, extending his hand, "for giving me a second chance, for showing me what respect really means." Shaq shook his hand firmly. "Just keep paying it forward," he replied. The experience at Morrison's Auto Emporium was no longer just a story of conflict. It had become a story of redemption, growth, and hope. Months had passed since the incident at Morrison's Auto Emporium, but the ripple effects of Shaquille O'Neal's actions continued to spread. What began as a humiliating confrontation had transformed into a powerful movement. The dealership, once tainted by Richard's arrogance, had become a symbol of redemption. But for Shaq, this was just the beginning. Sitting in his living room one evening, Shaq scrolled through his social media feed. Videos, comments, and testimonials poured in from people around the world. A young woman shared how her boss had implemented workplace training inspired by Shaq's initiative. A father posted about how he used the story to teach his son the importance of respect. Each message added to the growing realization that this wasn't just a viral moment, it was a lasting change. Determined to keep the momentum going, Shaq expanded Respect in Action into a full-fledged foundation. The foundation provided training programs for businesses, schools, and community organizations. Its goal was simple yet profound: to create a culture where respect was the norm, not the exception. The foundation's first major project was funding scholarships for underprivileged students. Shaq personally reviewed some of the applications, moved by the stories of resilience and determination. One letter stood out. A teenager from a low-income neighborhood wrote, "People look at me like I'll never be anything because of where I'm from. I want to prove them wrong." Shaq smiled, imagining the opportunities this scholarship could open for the young boy. Meanwhile, Morrison's Auto Emporium underwent a transformation of its own. Under Richard's leadership, now tempered by humility, the dealership embraced Shaq's vision. They partnered with the foundation to host workshops and community events. The once exclusive showroom became a welcoming space for people of all backgrounds. Customers noticed the difference. Reviews praised not just the cars, but the kindness of the staff. Richard, too, had changed. Humbled by his mistakes, he became an advocate for respect and inclusion. He often spoke at events organized by the foundation, openly sharing his experience. "I'm not proud of how I acted," he admitted at one such event, "but I'm proud of what I've learned, and I'm grateful for the chance to make things right." Shaq watched these changes unfold with quiet satisfaction. For him, the most rewarding moments came from the stories of everyday people inspired by the movement. A taxi driver in New York shared how he now greeted every passenger with a smile, regardless of their appearance. A restaurant owner in Texas posted about hiring staff from diverse backgrounds, saying, "Respect isn't just good for business, it's good for the soul." The impact reached far beyond the United States. In London, a luxury boutique launched a campaign called "Kindness is Class," inspired by Shaq's story. In Tokyo, a tech company implemented respect training as part of their onboarding process, citing Shaq's actions as their inspiration. One day, Shaq returned to Morrison's Auto Emporium, not as a customer, but as a guest of honor. The staff had organized a small ceremony to thank him for his impact on the dealership and the community. Richard stood beside him, holding a plaque engraved with the words, "Respect changes everything." As the crowd applauded, Shaq took the microphone. His deep, steady voice filled the room. "What happened here wasn't just about me or Richard or this dealership," he began. "It was about all of us. Every one of us has the power to make someone feel valued or to tear them down. And the choice we make doesn't just affect them, it defines who we are." The room fell silent, his words sinking in. Shaq looked out at the crowd, his gaze soft yet commanding. "Respect isn't hard. It doesn't cost a thing. But its value? That's limitless. As the ceremony ended, Shaq stepped outside, the sun setting over the city. He looked back at the dealership, now a place of redemption and hope, and smiled. The lesson had been learned, the impact felt, and the legacy of kindness was just beginning.